All right, welcome everyone. I am here today with Dan Shahar. I have been using portions of his textbook in an honor seminar on the ethics of meat eating. And Don is currently a teaching assistant professor and the director of the MBA program at West Virginia University. He had prior appointments at UNC Chapel Hill, University of New Orleans, and at Tulane. He's written a number of papers in environmental ethics and environmental policy. One notable one from 2020, Harm, Responsibility, and the Far-Off Impacts of Climate Change, won the International Society for Environmental Ethics Holmes Rolston Early Career Prize in Environmental Philosophy, a sort of distinguished award. I'm not actually here to talk about that paper, though. I'm here to talk with him about his recent book. This is what it looks like. It's provocatively titled Why It's Okay to Eat Meat, published with Routledge in 2022. So first of all, Don, this is a really common practice, and I wanted to start out by giving you an opportunity to say, like, why did you feel like it was important to write a book justifying something that the vast majority of people in the developed world already do and don't seem to have a ton of reservations about?
Yeah, good question. So the simplest answer is that I was invited to write it. So I received an email one day from an editor at Routledge, and I guess they had been having a conversation with one of our colleagues about how, in the literature on food ethics, there's a huge number of really influential perspectives that argue that it's not okay to eat meat. And yet, as you're saying, these perspectives are in pretty stark contrast to what the vast majority of people actually do. And yet there wasn't a lot in the literature that was kind of sensitively and thoughtfully defending the other side of the issue, trying to make the case that it is okay to eat meat. And when you do find people who are trying to make that kind of case, it's usually going to be kind of weird ways of eating meat. So some people might say, like, it's okay to eat meat, but only if you eat the most humanely raised meat that is available. That's 99% of what's at the supermarket doesn't qualify. Or maybe it's okay to hunt, right? But it's not okay to eat most of the meat that you actually would see out in the world. So there's this kind of weird asymmetry between the state of the literature and what people actually do. And so this editor at Routledge, came to the opinion that, well, it would be good to see if we can find someone who would be willing to, to make that case. The person that they were talking to agreed, but said that they wouldn't be interested in writing the book themselves. But they offered my name as somebody who might be interested in writing that book. And actually, as it turns out, I had never written anything on the meat issue at that time. But what I had written on was this broader question of individual responsibility in the face of large scale collective action problems. So, big problems like climate change and things like that. What are individuals' responsibilities in those kinds of situations? And so they thought, maybe I would be a good fit to write on this topic. And I saw the fit too. But in addition to seeing the kind of conceptual fit between my research and the project, I also just kind of felt, I don't want to say the call of duty exactly, but I felt told that I needed to answer for myself here, right? Because I am a meat eater. And I don't eat meat in some weird way. I just, I go to the grocery store like most other people and buy meat. I order it at restaurants and so on and so forth. And, I thought that it was okay. I thought I had reasons for this, but when somebody said, look, the world needs somebody to actually stand up and explain why this is okay. I kind of felt a little bit like if I said no, then I would be being a coward. And so I said, sure, I will do this project. I will write this book. And here's the result.
Yeah, so to reiterate one idea that you said is in the book, you use the language defending meat eating in the regular way. So there are actually lots of what I would describe as qualified defenses of the practice of eating meat, but they, as you allude, involve animals being raised in non-normal conditions where their welfare is much higher than what it typically is in industrialized farming operations, or it involves hunting your own meat, or being, say, I don't know, an Inuit tribe hunting caribou, or some kind of specific cultural context where you may actually be tied into your survival or something like that. And then things get even weirder when you start looking at there's an actual literature on the ethics of eating roadkill, which no one does, or at least that's a very, very rare practice to the extent that it happens. So what I interpreted as being the unique part of your project is you were saying like, no qualifications. I'm going to try to defend meat eating as the ordinary consumer in a country like the United States actually does it, going to a supermarket, buying the hamburger meat at whatever price per pound, going home, eventually preparing it and eating it. No special dimensions of it.
So
So
let me just jump in for 1 second and say I wouldn't want to say no qualifications, right? I think surely there are ways of eating meat that are wrong. So like, people will often give sort of silly examples in the literature of like, the carve your own steak restaurant where, they lead the cow in and, give you the knife and say, you can have whatever cut you want. Right. And this is an example that's meant to kind of illustrate the sort of wrongness of this practice. I think, if people were eating meat in a way where they were directly imposing, grotesque harms on animals, that with their own hands, that would be something that I would say probably, you should just never ever do that. And similarly, you can come up with other things like, people who just like very wastefully buy vast quantities of meat to, ostentatiously cook and eat a little bit of it and throw the rest in the garbage and say like, yes, I'm very glad that I helped to contribute to a great deal of, animal death through my dinner, right? Like, taking that kind of public stance, also like a pretty, gross way of behaving. So I don't want to say with no qualifications, but I take your broader point, right, that I don't want the qualifications to be ones that, rule out the way that normal people live their lives. So I would say, the thing I'm defending is just being a regular meat eater, who's not being obnoxious, but who's also not being particularly careful and meticulous either.
right. So the meat eater who is not ostentatious or revels in the cruelty to animals or things like that. People who have normal attitudes
Yeah.
toward meat purchasing and consumption. So with that as backdrop, I'll invite you here to just kind of, if you want to kind of take us through what the overall position of the book is or the main argument or arguments, I'll give you the floor to do that here for the audience.
Yeah. So the book is kind of interesting in its structure in that I take on a lot of different kinds of arguments over the course of the book. And so for that reason, a little bit it resists, just like giving one punchy idea as the summary. But I think sort of stepping back and looking at the book as a whole, and kind of getting back to my identity as a researcher a little bit, I think probably the biggest idea that is the overarching message of the book is this idea of specialization and division of labor in tackling the world's problems. So the thought being, right, that we live in a world where, there are lots and lots of different problems that cry out for people's attention. And people will often point to individual problems, whether that's global hunger or the suffering of animals, or systemic racism. You can kind of go down the list and say everybody has a moral obligation to do something about this, right? This is a huge problem that we face. It's not being addressed. People need to take action on this. And if you take all of these different calls to action together, it implies a kind of generalist picture of, of altruism or being a pro-social actor, where people are doing a little bit about a lot of different problems, presumably in the hopes that, all these little contributions will kind of add together and result in a big cumulative change. And I think when you take that generalist picture and kind of look around at how we make progress on other problems, in our lives, you'll see that it kind of contrasts with the more normal way of doing things, which is where we have specialization and division of labor, right? So, society needs food, society needs medicine, society needs education, right? We don't think that the solution to those problems is for everyone to do a little farming, do a little healing, do a little teaching, and so on, right? We think, no, it's okay for people to just be a farmer, right? And not also be a doctor and not also a teacher. And that's kind of the way that things get done. And in fact, we know that because specialization and division of labor have great impacts on people's productivity and their effectiveness, that way of doing things actually allows us to achieve more together than we could if everybody was trying to do a lot of little things about a lot of different problems all at once. And I think that when it comes to tackling moral problems, there's something to be learned from that approach, this idea of specialization and division of labor. But I think when we translate the idea to the moral domain, there's kind of a temptation to try to, have one's cake and eat it too, and say, okay, yeah, maybe it's fine if you want to specialize in some problems and not try to tackle everything all at once, right? But, maybe while you're specializing, shouldn't you also like do my thing? So, like why maybe you're going to be a specialist in saving the whales. Great, that's fine. But shouldn't you also be worried about your carbon footprint? Or shouldn't you also be a vegetarian? And so as a kind of general project, I'm kind of interested in this question of, are there specific problems that demand specific responses of us, regardless of what kinds of problems we want to take on? And I think the meat eating issue is, a pretty sort of prime example of this kind of case where people say, look, do whatever you want to try to make the world a better place, but you should also be a vegetarian. And so what is going on in this book in a lot of ways is looking at, well, what are the arguments for why vegetarianism would stand out as this kind of special kind of cause or special kind of action that would be required of everybody, regardless of what they want to do to try to help tackle the world's problems. And so the chapters of the book each kind of take on a different line of thinking about some of these problems and why vegetarianism sort of stands out as special, and trying to show why actually those arguments don't work. And vegetarianism ends up looking like one option for something that people can specialize in to try to make the world a better place, but not something that's specifically required over and above all the other options that people have.
Okay, so I want to dive in a little bit to some of the specific arguments that you look at in some of those chapters. I know when I started studying this stuff for the first time, which goes back over a decade, one of the most influential arguments in the literature, and it's a fairly intuitive one, something like this: when I go to the store and when I purchase a meat product, I am making an economic contribution to the continuation of that practice. I'm helping that whoever produced, and whatever different entities were caught up in the causal chain of the production of the meat and the distribution. I'm helping them out economically in some sense. It's a small amount, but especially if you aggregate these purchases over years, or maybe even a lifetime, the thought is it adds up. And I should not support them by making these economic purchases. And so one of the common arguments against the permissibility of eating meat, if you think that there's something wrong with the industrialized farming operations, is that you shouldn't do it because you're contributing to the problem. You're making it worse. You're making it easier for these businesses to continue to do what they do. Whereas if you stop eating meat, then you affect the market in a negative way, and you will make it harder for them to economically sustain themselves and bring us one step closer toward, a more, if not a vegetarian future, then at least a future where there are fewer animals slaughtered for human consumption. So hopefully I've presented that argument clearly enough. How do you respond to this argument in the book?
Yeah, so thanks. I think as far as clarifying goes, I think one thing to try to clarify a little bit is what we mean by this idea of helping or supporting or contributing to, and what the issue is there. So, one story you could tell is a kind of directly causal story where, when I eat meat, my money is driving the production of these products, and increasing let's say the animal suffering, increasing the environmental impacts, and so on. But you could also tell a story where there's just something about the contributing itself, right? Or the helping, the act of giving money is in some sense like taking a side on something or lending symbolic support, or you can tell other kinds of stories about what is wrong with the contribution. And I think these two different ways of cashing out, of sort of specifying the argument, they imply different kinds of moral issues. I think, if the direct causal story is true, right, where when I put meat, into my shopping cart, or I order meat at the restaurant, right, that's directly causing worse outcomes for animals, let's say, then I think that is going to generate a very strong case against eating meat. I argue in the book that it's not true that there is that really tight causal connection. We can talk about that a little bit in a moment. But I think if there were that kind of really tight connection between what I eat and what happens on the factory farm, let's say, then that would be a very strong type of argument against eating meat. I just actually think that the connection isn't there. But on the other hand, these other kinds of considerations, like what my purchases say about me and my integrity and my the symbolic relationship of me and the producer, and things like that, I think those kinds of considerations aren't as straightforwardly false, right? It's not like I'm going to say they're getting something wrong in some really deep way. But with those kinds of arguments, I tend to think that they don't succeed in showing that this is an obligation people have, but instead they show why this is something that it could be good to become vegetarian, or as I know that you've talked about reducing our consumption of meat products, even if we don't go all the way to vegetarianism. These are things that can be good to do, but not necessarily obligatory. So I'm sorry if that's a little bit circuitous, but just kind of drawing a wedge between the direct causal story, which I think is very powerful if true, but I think it's false, versus these other kinds of support relationships, which I think aren't as clearly false, but they're also not as strong in terms of generating an argument for vegetarianism. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more through either dimension of that, as you prefer.
Yeah, let's talk about the direct causal variation of the argument, where there is so on this account, there would be some kind of causal chain we could follow where I make a purchase, or again, maybe we're looking at the aggregation of my meat purchases over some, a month, a year, whatever. And we could, if we had the data, we could trace that back to some kind of, it would be small, but some kind of economic impact, right, on the meat industry. Or so that's how the story goes. So why do you think the story doesn't actually go that way, or that this process does not have a tangible impact on the meat industry?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two features of the situation that make it hard to apply that kind of argument. One is that the relationship between our consumption decisions and what is actually produced, or how factory farmers are kind of running their operations, those relationships are mediated by, more than one decision maker. So it's not just, when I am eating a chicken, right, that is directly resulting in another chicken being produced, but it's that I am, going to the supermarket, and, if I'm going to make a difference, it's going to have to be through changing what the supermarket orders. And if the supermarket changes its behavior, and that's going to have an impact, then it has to operate by changing what the meat producer is going to do, right, in terms of their production plans. And so there are these different levels of decision makers that mediate my relationship to what happens at the farm. And then the second aspect of it that makes it hard is that each of those decision makers is operating in a kind of strategic way, where they're not just responding mechanically to orders as they come in and saying, well, I got another order for a chicken, right, I'm going to produce another chicken. But instead, they are making strategic plans based on a projection of what they think is going to happen in the future. And in order for me to change their behavior, I need to, in some sense, change their plans, their projections, or their intentions about how they're going to navigate their business environment. And so, the problem is basically that because both of these things are happening at the same time, in order for me to have an impact, I need to change the behavior of multiple decision makers along the supply chain, right? All of whom already have made plans on the basis of knowing that the market is noisy, it has fluctuations, people buy and don't buy products all the time, that this is just part of the normal course of doing business. And they have projections about what they think demand is going to be, what they think their costs are going to be. All of these kinds of factors are like already known to them when they're but long before I get involved in the picture. And so in order for me to make an impact, I need to, in some sense, change their plans from what they were expecting to do in my absence. And I need to do that at multiple stages, right? So I need to change what the grocery store does, and the grocery store's small change needs to get, to have an impact on what the meat producer does. And so the basic thought is that, in a typical kind of situation where you're dealing with noisy, fluctuating markets and people who are working with really large numbers of customers, as a normal course of doing business, the chances that one customer's change of behavior would result in that kind of cascade of people changing their plans is just a very low probability of being true. Not to say it's impossible, but just to say, like, that's not what you should expect to happen. What you should expect to happen is that when you go to the grocery store and buy a chicken, that fact is just getting lost in the noise of, people coming to the grocery store and buying more or less of stuff, on a week to week basis. And that's not going to change what the grocery store puts in its order for next week, because it's just kind of neither here nor there for that plan.
Okay, yeah. So I have a couple of follow-ups here. So this is something I observed by looking at just the comments on a couple of your other interviews. So one concern that a significant number of listeners have evidently had is that this account is in some way committing. It goes by many names. I've seen it as the decision point fallacy, the Sorites paradox, the continuum fallacy. This is the idea that uh, because a difference between two states is imperceptible, you can't make a difference between them. But if you take that on board, you can get some really bizarre results. Like if I started pulling hairs off my head, there would be no perceptible difference with each individual hair. But eventually I would be bald, and there would be a very obvious difference between, my current appearance and being bald. So I think some folks are looking at this like the thought is your economic contribution is not perceptible in the system, but it is there, and it is making some kind of change, however like small or incremental. So I'm curious if you would have something to say to a person who interprets this that way.
Yeah, so I think the issue isn't so much that people's influence is small, right, or imperceptible. It's more that you're operating in a strategic environment rather than one where people are kind of acting mechanically on the basis of things as they come in, right? So I think if you lived in a world where suppliers and retailers were, responding to market signals in this mechanical way, where like, as buyers are coming in and buying chickens, or grocery stores are ordering boxes of chickens from the supplier, every time those things come in, they're responding by like turning the crank and producing that many more chickens. Then I think the decision point framing would actually make a lot of sense, right? There might be a question of, if there are certain kinds of thresholds in the market, there might be a question of exactly when are you crossing those thresholds. But each customer in that kind of environment would have some chance of crossing the relevant thresholds. And plausibly it would be an even chance, right? So, there's people often give an example of like, okay, maybe chickens come in boxes of 20, right? And so that means that 95% of the time, 19 out of 20 times when you buy a chicken, that's not making a difference, because that doesn't result in the additional box of chickens being ordered. But then 1 in 20 times you cause them to order another box of chickens. And so you say, all right, well, 19 out of 20 chance of zero impact, 1 out of 20 chance of impact is 20 chickens. On average, it means that you have a 1 in 20 chance of having an impact of 20. It's equal to your expected impact being every time you eat a chicken, that's 1 chicken on average that is your impact. I think that's a totally sensible way of kind of running the math if you're in this kind of mechanical type of environment. Yes, you don't know exactly whether you're going to be that 20th customer, but you could still sensibly operate that. But that framing, right, doesn't make a lot of sense in an environment where people already have plans that are based on projections of the future, right? So like imagine a grocery store that instead of ordering chickens reactively every time they run out of chickens, they have a general plan of we order 25 boxes of chickens a week, right? And maybe that's based on historical data about how many people come in to buy chickens, in a given week. And they recognize that, some weeks we're going to run out of chickens, some weeks we're going to have chickens left over. It doesn't, the grocery industry is nice and neat like this. So, we just have to live with the fact that the number of chickens that we get in these boxes is not going to line up exactly with the number of people who come into our store. But 25 is a good, guess, right? In that kind of case, right, an individual consumer who goes in and buys a chicken does not have a 1 in 20 chance of causing an additional box of chickens to be ordered, right? They might have some chance of changing what the store does, but it would be extremely small, right? It would be the kind of chance that, you know, not only would it need to be the case that the store had, you know, fundamentally like misjudged their market, which probably is not going to happen, right? But you would need to be the one person, right, whose behavior tips them over the scale of recognizing that they misjudged things, right? And being in that kind of situation is just going to be very uncommon, right? If their practice is to order 25 boxes of chicken a week and they've based that on good data, then the chances that you're going to change that plan are just very small because it's a good plan, right? You might still be able to introduce a kind of decision point model to think about that, right? But it would be a very different kind of model of a very different kind of question. So for instance, you might say, well, but how many customers changing their diets would it take to change the grocery store's plan from ordering 25 boxes a week to maybe ordering 24 boxes a week? And maybe there's an answer to that question, right? And maybe it does still have some of these dimensions of vagueness where it's like, well, how do you know exactly how many customers that would take? And how do you know if you're that customer? But the point is just that the probabilities at play there are going to be very different, right? So first of all, you're not talking about a 1 in 20 chance of having a 20 chicken box being ordered, right? That probability calculation now has nothing to do with what we're measuring now. Now what we're measuring is what's the probability that we're going to be at the specific threshold where the grocery store would change its operations and start ordering a different number of boxes every week. And right, you know, there's the question of, you know, as one individual consumer, what is the chance that you're going to be like the one person at that threshold that causes the change? That would be, under normal circumstances, very low, right? Normally, if the market has changed so much that the grocery store now needs to order a different number of boxes of chicken in a week, it's probably because, you know, some significant change has happened in their market, right? And now they need to make a different type of plan going forward. And that change probably didn't depend on whether you had chicken for dinner. Like that was probably just a judgment about the market more generally, right? And so, you know, that aspect of things, right, where people are operating in this strategic environment on the basis of plans rather than, you know, acting in this mechanical way, makes it so that the sort of straightforward decision point model doesn't apply, right? And of course, things get even more complicated when you add additional steps to the supply chain, so that in order to have an impact, it's not just that I would need to change what my grocery store orders, but it also would need to be the case that the meat producer, right, is right at their threshold, where like if a small change in what this grocery store order is today, right, would lead them to change their projections about what they need their, you know, chicken house operations to be doing, right? That's probably not going to happen, right? And so I don't want to say again that it's like zero chance of happening, but the probabilities are just exceedingly small, and they're so small that it doesn't really help to think about things. I think using the sort of moral power of this causal type of argument, I think, you know, it's much more persuasive to try to point to other kinds of considerations that don't rely on us having this sort of measurable big causal impact on production.
Yeah, well, thanks for that explanation. I think one thing I would also want to add, this is not an original point to me, but something that I first became aware of in reading some of Bob Fisher's work. The impact, if you actually had the situation where your individual contribution does trickle up the causal chain, there's actually no guarantee that the effect would be positive for animals or actually anybody. because the observation by, say, the people working on the factory farm and managing operations might be, well, we're going to cut back on maintenance next year because our profit margins were not quite what we wanted. So we're not going to do you're not going to do as much like yearly maintenance or inspections or something changes like that. And now maybe you have more malfunctions with your auto cutters, or your captive bolt guns are not up to code. And so there are more cows going through the process that are conscious rather than having been properly stunned. And so now you have an increase in the animal suffering. So like there's also like a level of uncertainty on what the actual effects would be if they did go up the chain. I think that one of the latent assumptions in this kind of argument is that if my economic contribution is perceived, the difference it makes will be positive to operations. And so even if it's a very low probability, it's still a low probability of a positive outcome. But I don't think that's actually true. I think that there's a chance of you actually making things worse. But your take is whatever the probabilities are, positive or negative, they're so small that they should not play a role in our moral decision making. Is that fair to say?
It's at least not that persuasive of an argument. Yeah. I mean, I think, to your point, right? I think there's this kind of starve them out type mentality about, what the goal of our, interventions in this arena should be, where like the best way to make things better to animals would be to starve out these meat companies so that they, don't have resources and they're forced to shut down. But you might think, it's actually, in addition to some of these like maintenance-y type issues you raise, you might think like, under what circumstances would a meat company be most likely to, to be starting to think in these very beneficent terms about, improving animal welfare and, maybe even transitioning to, less meat-centric solutions, like if we want the meat companies to be, thinking in a kind of constructive way rather than in a sort of like self-serving survivalist way, right? It's going to be the situations where they're actually doing better, that are going to be more conducive to them starting to adopt, more conscientious practices. And so that's just kind of a challenge in trying to reform industries in general, right? If people are bad actors, they're probably going to get worse when they're threatened. And if you're going to have any chance of getting them to reform in a positive direction, it's probably going to be when they don't feel threatened and when they feel like they have resources and they're safe. Then they might start thinking about new ways of doing things better. And so that's just a strategic question, of how do you actually reform some of these industries and under what circumstances are they going to be more likely to be reformable. But I think, as you say, I don't really focus too much on those kinds of things in the book, just because I really don't think that what we do as consumers, on the margin has a really sort of tight connection with any of this stuff. And so, Bob and others, I think, are right to say, if we did have an impact, there would be these interesting questions about, which direction those impacts would be. But I just think, yeah, but we don't have those impacts.
Yeah. So would you say that for someone who is moved by the horrors of industrial animal agriculture, of which there are many, would you say that the better exercise of your moral energies is to do something like political activism instead of working to make your own personal dietary restrictions?
I mean, I have a really hard time navigating this space in terms of how to get involved constructively. It's one of these things where, in writing the book, I feel like I learned a lot about what the problems are and what the different kinds of arguments are, the different kinds of perspectives are. But if you just ask, well, if I'm a person who really cares about this stuff and I want to do something about it, what does that look like? I have a really hard time actually like persuading myself that I have any expertise on what the answer to that is. It seems really hard to get involved in this area in an impactful way, particularly because of how polarized it is. And you've got these pretty well resourced, angry constituencies who are kind of squared off, and they've got a lot of weaponry to bear on their side, and it's pretty much seems like a stalemate right now. And yeah, I mean, maybe so. Like, I think vegetarians and their allies seem clearly to invest less in political action than you know um than might be warranted by the size of their movement and the resources that they collectively have. So like you hear things like, oh, the big meat industry with all of their money, right? And you look at the amount of money the meat industry spends on lobbying, and it's like, I don't remember what the numbers are. I actually had them in the book. But it's like some amount of money where, like, if the vegetarians of the United States would just donate like $10 each, they could raise like substantially more money than the meat industry spends on lobbying, with a minimal donation. So I think from a movement standpoint, um, there is this sense that political advocacy is probably an area that could use more attention and more resources, and where maybe some of the individual diet stuff is maybe overemphasized as a strategy. But as an individual, I don't know how feasible it is for most people to really move the needle on that stuff in a substantive way. Like, do I think that you donating $50 to a candidate is going to do anything? Like, probably not, actually. And so, I mean, I struggle in this area, to be perfectly honest. To really identify like what are the things that if you cared about this that you should do. I wish I had a better answer for you on that, but I don't.
Yeah, so just a hard problem to work out. I was glancing momentarily at the notes in a couple of the chapters to try to find, because I remember the statistics that you cited about. It was a shockingly small. I mean, it's still in the. I think it was still in the tens of millions of dollars for what the meat industry donates, but relative to the amount of money that they have at their disposal, that is super tiny. It's like, less than 1% of what would be available to them if they wanted to go at it more. And there are millions of vegetarians, or at least based on the data we have. So yeah, $10 from each of them would be more money raised toward those causes than.
I mean, think about what the market capitalization of the meat companies is, right? Like, all of the shares that exist in the marketplace for these publicly traded corporations in many cases, like how much does that actually amount to? And how many vegetarians are there? How much would it cost to buy those companies?
Yeah, well, I'm not the economic expert, so I don't know the answer to that specific question, but yeah, there are definitely some interest. I think that one of the takeaways, especially because towards the end of the book you put forward this kind of positive view of, hey, like maybe animal activism doesn't have to be your cause, but you should have a cause, and you should be in a sort of problem-ridden world like ours. You should be trying to make the world a better place in some way by addressing some significant moral problem. And so I think that one of folks who read to the end of your book, whether they agree or disagree, are probably going to then wonder, like, well, what should I do? And some of these people will probably still be sympathetic um, to the animal welfare cause, and may wonder, like, well, what actions could I do that might actually make a difference. I did want to, we're going back a little ways in the conversation, but I wanted to, so suppose someone is reading through your book, they get to this inefficacy stuff in chapter 4, and they're like, okay, but even if I'm not making a difference in terms of increasing or decreasing the number of animals that get slaughtered, there's still a sense in which I'm wrapped up in the practice of meat consumption, like I'm complicit in it. in some way. And certainly when I have taught some of this material in environmental ethics classes in the past, this tends to be the most common reason. Is it's not about this making a difference idea. It's about being associated with this unjust collective practice. Um, and some people think that is grounds enough to say you should dissociate from it. You should not be caught up in it. So how do you respond to folks who would say that's the reason you have a moral obligation not to eat meat?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is just that, I have sympathy for this idea. I agree complicity is something that's, you know, undesirable. It would be nice, if we could reduce our complicity in problems. I kind of have two main worries about complicity talk in general. Um, One of the worries is just, I think complicity is kind of a fact of life in modern societies, right? You think about all of the different problems that we are in some way connected to, right? Problem of climate change stands out as a really big one. Um, Problems having to do with, unfair labor practices or abusive labor practices, the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, even vegetables, right, are wrapped up in a lot of this kind of stuff. And there's always the fact that even if we personally don't consume any of that stuff, like the people we buy from probably do. And so we're pretty much never going to be more than like one step away from some complicity in these really serious problems, pretty much as long as we live in a modern civilization. And so I think that's one kind of reservation about treating this as something that's a knockdown argument for avoiding a specific type of consumption, which is just yeah, we're a lot of our consumption makes us complicit and stuff. That's just something that we kind of have to live with. The other problem that I have with this kind of talk is just that it seems like it puts the focus in the wrong place, right? It puts the focus on us and our personal sort of relationships with things and our purity, in a sort of dirty world, rather than on solving the problems themselves. And that strikes me as, I don't want to say that having clean hands is worthless, but if your focus is on having clean hands instead of on solving problems, that seems like a problem. So in the book, I kind of make 3 points of what I think the moral relevance of complicity is. One point is, I think we just should grant reducing complicity has some value, especially like if we can do it at relatively low cost. There's something to be said for doing that. I also think being implicated in certain problems gives us, some additional reason to focus on those problems in particular rather than other problems that we're not implicated in. And I also think, as a third point, people who are implicated in serious problems just have an obligation to do more, to try to make the world a better place than people who are not complicit. So I think all of those things are true and they are moral upshots of complicity. But I also give the example of, contributing to smog pollution to kind of illustrate that these types of considerations are maybe a little bit more limited than people sometimes think. So, take the example of smog, right? People drive their cars in crowded cities, and if they don't have the right kind of pollution control devices on their cars, that can give rise to some pretty serious air pollution, makes people sick, shortens people's lives, um, dirties up the buildings and stuff. And people are implicated in these problems, like people are dying because of smog, and you're implicated in causing that smog. In an environment where people just generally don't have adequate pollution control technology on their car, you as an individual nevertheless could, maybe go out and install that equipment yourself, or maybe just don't drive. I think, yeah, there is some value to doing that to eliminate your complicity in this problem. Like if it's really costly to, to give up driving or to install this equipment unilaterally, like is it decisive that you have moral obligation to take on those costs? I kind of don't think so. I at least don't think it's obvious. Um, you know, it does provide some additional reason to focus on the smog problem, the fact that you as a driver are contributing to it. Do I think that that's an overriding argument, like that you shouldn't focus on something else and you really do have an obligation to tackle smog in your city? I mean, I think it has some weight, but it's not necessarily decisive. And like, how much more should be expected of you because you live in a smoggy city than if you didn't live in a smoggy city? Like, I don't know, not that much. So I think, when you start thinking about other kinds of problems where people are implicated, and it's a big problem. It's not really something that's under their direct causal control, but they're implicated in it. I think we can see, complicity. It's a consideration. It has some weight, but it's not really as forceful of a consideration as people in this conversation, I think, sometimes suggest.
All right, yeah. So I have two quick things I want to follow up with about that, and then I want to shift to asking you a few questions that my students pitched to me when after they had finished reading significant chunks of your book. The two follow-ups is first, I can imagine, and I have heard folks from the vegetarian camp say this before, like, sure, promote your causes, do that sort of thing, but also be a vegetarian, because being a vegetarian is not that hard. Um, I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but this is kind of the general tenor of how that line of thought goes. Like, just look, it's you got to eat, just make a few dietary changes, and then sure, work on your smog problem, work on systemic racism, work on climate change, whatever. But whatever else you do, vegetarianism is compatible with that as a part of your lifestyle, and it's not that costly. So why not do it? Why isn't it obligatory? Something along those lines.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, I guess as far as the not that hard line goes, I guess I would say, the numbers are against that type of argument, right? You look at people who have actually tried to go vegetarian, and, depending on the particular statistics that you consult, you'll often find that former vegetarians dramatically outnumber current vegetarians. Probably the best study that I've seen estimated that, basically for every one vegetarian that is currently a vegetarian, there are 5 people who used to be one. And, the reasons why people stop being vegetarians after they start trying to do it, mostly have to do with the fact that this is kind of a costly enterprise, especially at first, right? But even over time. So, at first you're dealing with costs of, relearning how to eat, how to cook, which restaurants you can go to. You're facing lots of different kinds of social interactions in ways that you're not used to, and having to learn how to navigate those. Maybe you have family members who aren't supportive, or it's a constant friction every time you are going out to eat with certain people, going to family gatherings, just feeling like you're that person who is either not going to be able to participate, or in some cases people are actively antagonistic to vegetarians, right? And so, I mean, some of these costs come from the fact that we live in a world where other people aren't supportive, right? And so it's not that vegetarianism is in itself so hard, but that the world is kind of not set up to make vegetarianism easy. And that's something that has been getting better over time, and hopefully will continue to get better. And I think as it gets better, the case for this kind of argument will become stronger. But I don't think we're, at least currently, in a place where it's it's just sort of obviously easy for people to adopt this lifestyle. But even if you sort of set aside the costs of vegetarianism itself, um, there's also this kind of bigger issue, which is that changing the way that you eat and changing the way that you navigate lots of these different choice situations is just something that draws on your agency and your willpower. It forces you to navigate the world in an intentional thoughtful way, and exercise self-control and discipline in an area where a lot of people aren't used to doing that. And the status quo is, it's not that you have to make a hard decision, right? And so you might as well make the vegetarian decision. It's you have how to navigate the world as a meat eater. It's easy and second nature, and you have all sorts of habits and prior knowledge, right? So that's easy, right? What's hard is making a decision that's different from what you're used to, right? And if you want to see why that's hard, right, think about, well, why is it that people struggle to maintain a healthy diet, right? It's not because it's really that hard to avoid putting a cookie in your mouth, right? Like, yeah, you could just not eat the cookie. Like, that's not what's hard about it, right? What's hard about maintaining a healthy diet is that you have to change these habits, you have to change these thought patterns, you have to exercise will and overcome what you are inclined to do, what you're tempted to do, what you're used to doing, and to do things differently, and to do them because you in some sense feel like you ought to do it that way, and you need to overcome your temptation, right? Those are difficult things for people to do, oftentimes even if they really want to, right? People who in some abstract sense would like to change their diet and eat healthier, right? They struggle to do that in practice. And I think if you until you see what's hard about that, right, and why people struggle to do that, right, you're not really going to be able to appreciate what's hard about this thing that you're asking people to do here. So I'm not necessarily saying it's impossible, right? Obviously, lots of people are vegetarians. People thrive as vegetarians. I've lived with many vegetarians over the years, and people make it work. It's totally doable. But I don't think it's an easy option. And I think one way to see that it's not an easy option is, take a typical meat eater and ask them, which would you find easier, donating $1,000 a year to charity or not eating meat at all this year, right? I think in most cases you would find that your typical meat eater is going to say, oh yeah, no question, donate the $1,000, right? I will come up with the money, but I'm not going to become a vegetarian. And so if you're asking somebody to take on something that without even thinking about it, they could say, oh yeah, obviously I'd rather donate $1,000 to charity than do that, right? Then you're asking somebody to take on a form of action on a real problem, but a form of action that's probably more ambitious and more costly and more burdensome than almost anything else that they do to try to make the world a better place. Under the status quo, very few people take on things that are harder than giving $1,000 to charity. And plausibly, right, that $1,000 donation would make a bigger impact than them going vegetarian. So it's not that easy, and if it's not that easy, then it's also not that clear that it's a home run for where they're gonna devote their time and energy to trying to make the world a better place.
Right, and you may have already partially answered my other follow-up, but as you're aware, I'm kind of interested in trying to carve out arguments for a broadly reducitarian position. For those folks who don't know what reducitarianism is, it's something along the lines of your moral obligation is to reduce your meat consumption. You might extend that to also like maybe your consumption of dairy products, but to reduce your consumption of animal products in general. But it does not typically require going all the way to vegetarianism or veganism. And one of the things that I guess I wanted to ask you is like, you do acknowledge in chapter 6, it's not a bad thing to distance yourself to some degree from unjust practices. And so I thought that maybe a broadly reducitarian position might follow from the constellation of arguments that you had made, right? This combination of, okay, you're the causal chain is too complex and too many, and because of its structure, does not really allow me to make a difference, positive or negative, to the meat industry. But there are these sort of non-making a difference type of reasons that still carry some moral weight in our deliberations. And maybe going all the way to vegetarianism, depending on your constitution, your social situation, et cetera, maybe that really is too costly to demand of everyone. But almost all of us could cut back on our meat consumption to some degree without it being a particularly great sacrifice. In fact, there are some people that it would be objectively much healthier for them to eat less meat. So I was curious why you might say that's not strictly a moral obligation.
So yeah, I mean, I'm friendly to this kind of suggestion. If people read my book and the takeaway that, that they're, kind of bringing from this conversation is that, they want to reduce the amount of meat that they're eating as a way of contributing to tackling this problem. That to me is a great result. But I think you're right that some of the things that I said in response to your last question, I would want to bring back in here. I think, the big difference between, having to worry about something and, having it be something that you just don't have to think about, is a substantial, reason not to try to go in the reducitarian direction, where, I could see someone saying, look, it's not that eating meat, is so valuable to me, right? It's what's valuable to me is not having to, exercise willpower on this issue. And so, yeah, maybe when if I happen to think about it and, I'm feeling inclined at the moment, right, maybe I'll start trying to, order the vegetarian option a little bit more often, or maybe eating smaller meat portions or something like that. But, if I don't think about it, then I don't think about it. To me, that, that doesn't sound that costly to me. But, I think when most people have in mind a reducitarian orientation, it is this kind of more sort of ambitious approach than that, where at least you're saying, like, do I really want to eat meat right now, right? And having to ask yourself that question every time. And if, like, by the time you're asking yourself that question, right, that's like 90% of the cost. So I think, the thinking about stuff is a real cost that we need to be sensitive to. The other thing, though, is that I think the case for becoming a reducitarian kind of depends on what the value add is, right? So, when you're a vegetarian, there's a sense in which, like, not only are you reducing the amount of meat that you put in your mouth, but like, you are contributing to a movement that has a real identity, right? Whereas reducitarianism is like pretty nichey and not that well known. You are taking a pretty strong stand by like giving up meat entirely, whereas the reducitarian is like, they're taking a little bit of a stand, I guess, but it's like not that powerful of one. It's like, yeah, like I kind of sometimes I'm going to eat less of this. Like, yeah, okay, man, I'm like, good job. And so I guess, I tend to think that like the benefits of going with reducitarianism over vegetarianism or veganism or anything like that, right, are also liabilities. Yeah, it's easier because it's not as big of a deal. So it's the costs are lower and the values are lower in kind of lockstep. So it's not to, again, not to kind of be too harsh on the reducitarian approach. I think that's a totally valid way of kind of, walking away from my book. But I don't think it's like such a home run approach that I would want to say this is obligatory for people to do. Um, especially just given that like it's one more thing that we're asking people to take on. And it's just not clear to me that it has that much value where it would justify saying, yeah, no, this is a specific thing that everybody has a moral obligation to do, as opposed to just an option.
All right. Well, thanks for that response. I will make one small note, which is that there is some recent empirical data that the number of not reducitarians, but flexitarians, which I interpret as a type of reducitarianism, sort of, it's a little ambiguous, but that those folks now outnumber vegetarians and vegans in a number of countries, mostly in the developed world, like the US, the UK, etc. Now, whether or not that is a passing fad or that will actually become something more substantive, who knows? So this semester, as part of this honor seminar I've been doing on the ethics of meat eating, as I've mentioned a couple of times, we read some passages from your book, a significant amount of it. And I had the students kind of, if you had a question to ask Don at some point, what would it be? A few of them that had questions that I kind of wove into the questions I've already asked you, but there were a few other ones that kind of stood out that were commonly asked but didn't fit into some of the other material I prepared. So I'm going to run a few of those by you real quick. I'm going to start with a couple that are just kind of clarifying some elements of what I would describe as your positive view. This idea that you need to be active in the world and trying to make it a better place. And if you're doing that, then you are in some sense off the hook when it comes to being a vegetarian, right? If you're doing enough to promote other causes, you don't have to take up this other one as well. So a few folks asked basically like what would qualify as a significant enough cause to be in that category. And you've listed, we've discussed a few examples that I think would be fairly uncontroversial, things like systemic racism and climate change, etc. But what more would you have to say on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the answer to that question um, is going to probably be pretty different from individual to individual. I don't necessarily think that there's like some list of problems that we need to be choosing from. I mean, I think the bigness of a problem is one dimension that we should be paying attention to. I also think that our ability to actually make headway on something is probably more important in most cases. And I think probably for a lot of us, right, the opportunity that we have to make headway is going to be kind of inversely correlated with how big the problem is. So like your ability to really move the needle on factory farming issue is going to be pretty limited. Your ability to move the needle on maybe something a little smaller scale in your own community might be more substantial. But obviously the scope of the impacts there and the prospects for having a really major impact, right, are going to be kind of delimited there by just the fact that it's not that huge of a problem that you're tackling. So I think each of us, as we're kind of navigating these questions and trying to find our niche, just needs to think about like what are the talents that I bring to the table? What are the experiences I have? What kinds of connections do I have? What do I know a lot about? what what resources are available at my disposal. um, all of these kinds of questions, what kinds of projects make me feel passionately, like what do I care about, such that if I start really investing in this area, I'm going to want to do more, instead of, feeling like every contribution is just like this onerous thing that I do because I feel like I have to. Um, Asking these kinds of questions, is going to lead people in lots of different directions. And I don't, I don't have a sort of formula for what that should look like for everybody. I think, part of the idea here is like not just to find a hobby, but to like do something that actually matters and is taking on something that is really important. And so, if you find that you're taking on some like, local thing in your own community that is kind of fun to you, right? Like that might be the situation where you'd ask yourself, like, am I really doing enough here to make the world a better place? Or am I just kind of engaged in some like self-serving, like back patting exercise where I make myself feel good and I do something that I like? That's not necessarily the point. But at the same time, right, there are lots of people who like flame themselves out doing, like banging their head against the wall for impossible problems and end up accomplishing nothing, and just like, you know, taking on massive personal or psychological costs in order to, make no tangible difference. And I think we have to be really cognizant of that possibility as well. So I'm not sure if that's like a really like clear, compelling answer.
What it just sounded to me like there are other factors beyond the scope of the problem to consider, and it's the list of possible causes will depend on a person's talents, abilities, passions, um, what community they're situated in, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think you give the folks who have that question plenty to think about and how they might allocate their activism budget, as we might call it. A related question that a few folks had was whether you thought that the extent to which you have this general kind of obligation to try to make the world a better place kind of scales up as you are, say, wealthier, more educated, better socially situated, more privileged in other ways.
I think the answer is just straightforwardly yes, right? The more of a privileged position that you find yourself in, right, the more, I think it's reasonable to ask of you as someone who is in a position to solve problems. I mean, take the extreme case of somebody who's like doing everything that they can to satisfy their most basic needs, right? Like I'm not really I'm not really inclined to say that that person really needs to, be making big sacrifices, in order to promote the world's problems, like, or address the world's problems. I mean, in a way, right? Like we should be making sacrifices for that person. Whereas, somebody who is, a billionaire or something, that person, they should feel called on to do more. Um, Not just in the sense that like, you know, they can do more without it being even as onerous, right? Like if you're a billionaire, donating $1,000 to something would be much less burdensome than, for me to donate $100 to something, right? But even aside from those kinds of things where like they just have more resources, so it's easier for them to do stuff, it also just makes sense, to think, look, like you are doing so well that like you should be ready to sort of put in more work to help other people, get up to, a level that is closer to yours. I mean, I think that's totally reasonable to ask, not in the sense of like we need to like punitively tax away all of these people's resources, like, that kind of thing, but just in terms of like their moral duty to pitch in and be willing to make sacrifices, I think the better off you are, the more it makes sense to expect of somebody before they can say like, "Yep, I'm done."
Yeah, one of the considerations of various in various areas of ethics or global justice is this principle, the ability to pay principle, that other things equal, the parties with the greater ability to pay or ability, whatever the resource is, should bear a proportionally greater responsibility of alleviating whatever the problem is. So it just sounds kind of like an application of that principle. So the other questions I've got are a little bit more kind of about parameters of some of your arguments. One of them is there were a few students who thought that maybe you were underestimating the prospects for being part of like say intergenerational global change or a sea change and shift. Certainly there have been some we're situated here in the United States. I remember growing up, the change in attitudes towards, say, same-sex marriage is very quick and very dramatic. The shift from, say, like 1990 to 2010, leading up to the Supreme Court legalization of same-sex marriage. And I think that there are some of my students wonder if like, well, maybe part of the reason to like take on board this vegetarian movement is because you could be part of the sea change. You could be part of a change in cultural perceptions, the moral status of animals, and so on. And they seem to have some worries that you might be discounting that possibility or not giving it its proper moral weight. So what would you say about that sort of consideration?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say is, I agree with the sort of underlying principle, which is, if you have a movement that has the prospect of like sweeping into success, right? That gives us a lot more reason to want to participate in that movement and be part of that change. So I agree. The sort of, caveat to that is, vegetarianism in particular is a movement that has been around for a long time and has kind of been floating at a roughly stable proportion of the population for a while now. And the arguments are pretty much the same. The public familiarity with this is higher than it's ever been. And so, and it's easier now to be a vegetarian than it used to be, and yet it's not clear that that the numbers are really growing rapidly in line with that. So, I mean, I think there's a little bit of just, you know, um, there's just an empirical question of like, what reason do we have to think that we're really on the cusp of this kind of sea change, given that, it's not like this is new and it's not like anything has particularly changed like right now that would result in this, this very long-term effort suddenly like sweeping into being like generally adopted. So I guess that's a little bit of empirical reservation. But it's also just, this is something where, as an individual, it's kind of hard to move the needle on some of this stuff, right? So, you know, yeah, if there were things you could do to sort of spark the sea change as one individual, as opposed to just being in the sea change that's happening, then like, yeah, by all means, right? Go change the way that our world approaches food. Like, go do it if you can. But most people, struggle to move that needle substantially. And as I said, like the vegetarian movement has not been growing really dramatically. And so, if you just think about it on average, like every vegetarian on average is not producing substantially more than one vegetarian to replace themselves when they finally give up. And so, that's a very different situation from one where, you want to be part of that explosion that's about to happen.
Yeah, on the empirical side of things, I show the students some data on the trends both domestically, like here in the United States, and worldwide over the previous 50 years. And the graphs have a very clear direction. Meat consumption and production have both been going up at a very consistent rate over the last 50 years. And the projections for the future, at least what we can reasonably project out the next, say, 30 to 50 years, do not look any different. As there's not a lot of reason to think that the trends there are going to seismically shift in the next couple of generations. So one argument that I covered in my class that a few students were curious about your response to is I have a short unit on ecofeminism, and there's an ecofeminist argument for vegetarianism, which draws parallels to essentially the objectification of women and the objectification of animals. In both cases, we're focusing on like the physical body, like the woman's physical body, their sexuality, etc., and then the animal's flesh for the consumption of meat. And there are some feminist authors, the most notable of which is Carol Adams, have essentially argued that meat eating is sort of a gendered act that is associated with various kinds of patriarchal norms, and that when you consume meat, you are in some sense reinforcing those patriarchal gendered norms, and that the proper thing to do then is to refrain from meat eating as a kind of rejection of that of the patriarchy and its patriarchal associations. Now I'm really cutting some corners on my presentation of this argument for time, but do you have any impressions of how you might respond to that argument?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, it in a way it kind of depends how strongly it's put. So if you think that when people eat meat, they are like directly manifesting some kind of like grotesque attitude toward women, or even toward animals, then that would be the kind of consideration to say, like people should not do that ever, right? But if the point is more that, well, it's not to say that when you eat meat, you are manifesting this horrible attitude in that moment that you ought not to have, but this is just kind of thing that reinforces, and contributes to this bigger problem that we have as a society of, objectifying flesh and all of these things that go with it. Then that to me seems like maybe it's going to be more of something that falls into that category of like good to do but not obligatory, where you can say, look, contributing to the dissolution of gender hierarchies in society is an important and worthy goal, right? This is something that on the margin can help us to do that in certain ways. Obviously, like it's not the only source of these problems, and it's hardly the only thing that we do in our day-to-day life that has some relationship to reinforcing gender inequalities in our society. I think, yeah, if people want to focus their energy on dismantling gender hierarchies in society, and they want to do so through these kinds of pathways, then that's something to be celebrated. But I don't think that it's that plausible to interpret that kind of argument as generating a specific moral duty for sort of the reasons that I've been discussing, right? Like tackling gender hierarchies through the specific means of not eating meat is like a particularly narrow strategy for taking action on a particularly specified problem. And I think for all of the reasons that I think it's reasonable for people to focus in certain areas and not take actions in others, it would be okay for somebody to say, look, like, yeah, I even while granting that is a valid way to take action on a real problem, I'm going to focus my efforts in another area. I don't see the pull of saying that this is a specific obligation. Um, but again, it kind of depends on the force to which it's put. Like if you really want to try to convince me that um, no, it's not just a way of advancing this broader cause, but there's actually something really grotesque about what's going on when you put meat, in your mouth. Like, um, I'm open to to being persuaded, but it's not intuitive to me that that's an accurate characterization of what's going on in people's heads.
Yeah, well, I can see how, given the resources that you have put forward in the argumentative resources you put forward in your book, how you would situate this as one problem worthy of responding to and trying to solve. But again, not necessarily doesn't have to be the specific problem that everybody's trying to solve, and also not maybe in the same path, using the same pathway to doing so, that's being proposed. So the last question I want to pose to you is, I was surprised at how many students asked this, but evidently students are curious to hear you play devil's advocate against yourself. Um, what if you had to try to defend an argument for a broadly vegetarian position? What do you think would be the strongest argument? Or another way to put the question would be, what do you think was the hardest argument to come up with a response to in the process of developing your current position?
I mean, I think that some of this stuff about complicity and integrity and, kind of figuring out where you stand in the world, is is forceful. It's I don't think it's something that I have a knockdown argument against, so much as just to say, look, like I feel the pull of this, and I see that there is that pull in lots of places. And I don't know how much energy people have an obligation to devote to this particular, set of issues in this particular way. Um, but yeah, I mean, so like you read Jonathan Safran Foer's book on eating animals, right? And like that's a book that is just full of emotion and, you know trying to figure out where your heart is, and trying to figure out how you line up with what you believe in, right? And how you look yourself in the mirror. um, and I think, that stuff matters, right? If you care about being a good person, positioning yourself well in the world, right? And that there is this really grotesque stuff happening out there, and you are connected to it when you put food on your table, right? And that's the stuff you're feeding to your kids. um that's something that, as I think a mature person, right, you need to think about that. You need to figure out where you stand on it. And I think, you know the stuff that I recommend positively in terms of, you know actually figuring out, like, what are the problems that you want to do something about, how do you want to position yourself, in the world. Like, in a way, those are ways of answering the questions that are different from, it's a different answer than the one that my interlocutors arrive at, right? But it's a response to the same, I think, correct line of concern. um so I think those are the things that I feel the most pull from. With some of the other stuff that I talk about in the book, I think it's not correct, right? So like the stuff with, um like the direct causal connection stuff, it's like, yeah, with that, I think my view is that that's just not true, right? But with some of this other stuff, it's like, no, well, you're actually onto something. This is right. Your your specific response to it is a little bit different from what I think the response ought to be. Um, but it's not wrong. Um, I think the final chapter is probably the one that has the most of those arguments that I think are not wrong. Whereas the other chapters, I think there's a lot more stuff going on in those chapters where like where I'm coming down is that like this is just mistaken. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know that um, there are arguments that I feel like deeply uncertain about, where like I feel like they're challenging to me in that way. I feel like I'm comfortable with the responses that I give. But I think, you know, there are a number of arguments, particularly in that last chapter, where um, you know, I really do feel like they're onto something. And it's kind of on all of us to figure out, you know, how do we want to navigate some of those issues.
All right, well, Don, thank you so much for your response to all of my questions and for your time today. Do you have anything else you want to add before we conclude?
No, thanks so much for inviting me to do this, and you know, thanks to your students for bearing with my prose. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and you know, feel free to follow up with me if you guys have any further questions, and I will do my best to respond as soon as I can.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I will relay that to them. For those of you who've forgotten, the book is Why It's Okay to Eat Meat, Routledge 2022. I'll include a link where people can track it down if they're interested in the description. But Don, we both got places to be. So thank you again so much for your time. And I'm going to sign off.
Thanks so much.